Back in 2009, we met with James Lee Hutchinson, a World War II veteran and B-17 Flying Fortress radio operator. Now, in 2017, we've caught up with Hutch again at a Liberty Foundation event at the Metropolitan Airport in Indianapolis. The Liberty Foundation travels the United States with their current aircraft, the B-17 Madras Maiden, offering flights, tours and educating the public on the history, courage and sacrifice given by so many young men during World War II. For a fee, members of the public can take a short flight. They also offer trips for veterans. As a veteran, Hutch is flying today at the radio position he occupied during 20 missions all those years ago. Hutch, who at the age of 92 years is still teaching the younger generations about his experiences during the war, has now written several books on the subject.
I'm James Lee Hutchinson. I served in the United States Army Air Force as a tech sergeant, radio gunner, operator in World War II. I was drafted out of high school at the age of 18 and trained through basic training, radio school, gunnery school, combat crew training, and then we were assigned to B-17s for the combat crew training, and then on overseas. Sort of a perfect example of being drafted and going right through the complete federal education program and right on into combat. Well, I taught school for 37 years and I retired and traveled. But then around 2000, I had a heart attack. I also had a little farm and was lifting bales of hay and et cetera, and riding horses and doing all the things you shouldn't do at 65. And so I had a heart attack and it laid me up for 6 months or so. Meanwhile, my daughters found my combat diary. I should have brought it along. It's a little register book that I bought in the English shop. But I'd recorded my missions, and so they said, you have to do something with it. And of course, I didn't have a computer, and we were living down on a farm and no service. But so I wrote the thing longhand, and one of my daughters typed it. And she was in Memphis, and I would write it and mail it to Memphis. She'd type it and send it back. And so we always said we were supporting the U.S. Post Office. But we finally got that book done. My first book, Through These Eyes, sort of a play on words because I was stationed at I, and it was my story. So. And it was not well written. I've become a much better writer as time goes on. But that was my experience with this, and what I write about and all the other stories that these other people went through, because there were unbelievable things that happened. And I always feel like they need to be told. So I become, from a school teacher, I've become a historian. And now at 92, I've become an antique. And so that's what I do, is write and speak to schools and present programs to remind people of what we did. And they have forgotten it, and it is not taught. I was stationed in England, the 490th Bomb Group, Squadron 848. And the memories are fresh in my mind. And so I write history to keep our stories alive. I've been given many stories by families who want their ancestors remembered in the combat. And so I'm proud that I've recorded over 200 stories, actual combat stories, and of men who have passed. So the history will not be forgotten. Through These Eyes is my combat diary with background information about being in England and being trained and drafted and etc. And the second book then, when I finished that book, people began contacting me and saying, Uncle Harry wrote this for the family, and could you use it? And so I took Uncle Harry's story and edited it with my background. And so the second book was still again all about B-17s and about, so I didn't get quite enough information, so I put 25 stories about growing up my boyhood in that one. So that was bombs away. But I did have a lot of local people, because a friend and I had a TV station at Bedford North Lawrence High School, and we were interviewing. My job was to go out and find World War II veterans, and we were interviewing them. So I co-hosted that program and picked up a lot of stories from guys. And of course I was concentrating on the Air Force, but I picked up a lot of stories from tankers and infantrymen and the 9th Infantry and all that, and stored them, wrote them and stored them. And so after bombs away, I decided I should do another one, because they kept coming in, and then, like I say, they would have been lost. I mean, and so I concentrated on this. The third book was called Boys in the B-17, and I concentrated on the fact that we were so young. See, they took us in at 18, and in those days, you couldn't buy a beer, you couldn't drive a car, you couldn't vote, but we could fight. And so the war was won by a bunch of teenagers. Basically, that's what happened. When the draft started, they started at 21 to 35. Well, we were losing the war, basically. And so they dropped it to 18. As soon as you finish high school, you go into service. And the only reason I didn't volunteer was because I needed 6 credits to graduate, and I would have been the first one in my entire family to graduate from high school. I was in a little race with one of my cousins. Well, I got drafted, he didn't, so I got my high school diploma 2 years later in England. So I can always say I graduated high school in England. We had a crew of 10 men. We had the pilot, co-pilot, and then the bombardier and navigator, 4 officers. And then we had 6 enlisted men, engineer gunner, who sat up in front with the pilots, had the top turret. Then we had the radio operator who sat behind the bomb bay and monitored all receivers, and he also had a transmitter to send messages out if he needed to. The ball turret gunner was not able to get into the ball turret until we were in flight. We had two waist gunners, and we had a tail gunner. And so that was the basic crew. That was changed many times according to what the need was. When we became a lead crew, squadron leaders, they put the co-pilot in the tail gunner's position and took out the ball turret. That meant we lost 2 enlisted men. They were assigned to other crews. And they also added a radar operator, because the ball turret was replaced with a radar dome. And so we ended up with 6 officers and 4 enlisted men. I was strictly a lead radio operator. I had the responsibility of, when our squadrons took off, our formations left England, then we had to have contact with back, and the only contact we could make long distance was Morse code. And so my job was to, on the lead crew, my job was to send position reports. In other words, the mission was laid out and planned, and there were certain checkpoints that we had to report back. And when we reached those checkpoints, and we move on, and the next checkpoint. So I would send those back as the pilot directed. The navigator actually directed me to send them. And then, of course, when we reached the target area, we had what we called an initial point to start the bomb run. Mainly it was at high altitude bombing. They claimed that bombardier could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. And we weren't quite that accurate, but we did have the Norden bomb site, which was made here in Indianapolis. And it was very secretive at first, and we had an armed guard watch those bomb sites. They were always carried out to the plane and under armed guard. Later in the war, of course, several planes were lost, and the enemy found the bomb site, and it was no longer such a sacred secret. But the bomb site was actually a gyroscope, and the bombardier used it to control the plane on automatic pilot. And the bombardier had to be able to stabilize that plane and have it completely level so he could use the bomb site. Therefore, actually the bomb site worked as the automatic pilot. The pilot just sat back. The bombardier controlled the plane in that bomb run. And you just looked out, you saw the sky full of exploding shells and flak, and you flew into it. And that's, of course, when you learn to pray. We dropped our bombs, came out of the target area, and then the bombardier would tell me to send back a strike report. And so the people in England would know what we thought we had done. And many times we did drop the bombs right in the pickle barrel, because our targets were munition plants, bridges, railroad stations, and railroad complexes, I should say. And they needed to know, in England, they needed to know as quickly as possible what we had done. They were planning the next mission before we ever got home. Well, the thing we feared the most was the flak, but the fighters were always there. And early in the war, the German Air Force Luftwaffe was very strong, and our bombers were very unprotected, because we had fighter escorts that could only go so many miles into enemy territory, and then their fuel they'd just have just enough fuel to come back. By the time I got there, they were using added fuel tanks to the fighters, and therefore they could go all the way with us. And so the fighter squadrons would come up and protect us and patrol maybe 3 or 4 formations. And sometimes when they were going this way, a German enemy fighter came in this way. And so we were hit twice. We were hit once by the jets, the 262 jets, and they took out a plane or two. And so we tightened the formation and continue. And our fighters came back and engaged them, and so we could watch the air battle on our way to the target. And the second time we were hit by 109s, and they were much like the little P-51s. They were very little stingers, and they were very quick and very fast. And the fighter could riddle your plane or take some down if he took out a motor or so, or if you hit the gas tanks and the plane got on fire. And so you would see, I witnessed people bailing out, and I saw planes go down. There were a few pieces of armor here and there, but our main armor was what we wore, because we wore a flak jacket. Actually, it was made of woven steel covered with cloth, and you could fasten it together here at the shoulder so you were covered front and back. We just called it the flak jacket, or apron actually, and it would go down to below your waist, front and back. But the rest of it, we wore a helmet. We wore an Army helmet, but it was adapted to use ear flaps to cover our headsets. And so the protection we had was the helmet down like this, and the jacket like this, and our hands like this. And then as the fighters came in, of course, everybody manned a position except me, because I was lead. I couldn't lead the radio. Probably the most important time to be on it was to hear messages or instruction from the base, because they knew what the total picture was. Well, each base, we had 42 bomber bases, B-24s and B-17s. We had 3 divisions, and each base would have 50 to 60 planes. And each bomber group, like the 490th, would be assigned different missions. Each bomber group had 4 squadrons, but only 3 squadrons would fly. So if our group was assigned to fly, then our job was to get 36 planes in the air. We flew in squadrons of 12, and we flew 12 high, 12 middle, and 12 low. And we did that to offset dropping bombs, but we also did that because all the machine guns on these planes could have full fire at fighters. Because each B-17 had 13 50 caliber machine guns. And so we could put up a terrible amount of fire at any planes that came in. And on the day the 190s hit us, we were top squadron. We were flying high squadron, and I could look out my little canopy over the radio room and see this guy up here, and this fighter coming in, and our boys just shot him to pieces, and he was on fire and flaming, and he tried to hit us. Their intention always was, if they get you, you try to get one of them. And so he was coming at the lead plane, and he veered, and I saw the body. I saw the man with the black leather coat, and I saw he was dead, but the plane was still coming, and it missed us and crashed into the plane next on our right wing, and hit about the strongest part of the plane. It hit just where the ball turret connects to the wing. The ball turret gunner wasn't killed. He did have a broken leg, broken arm or something. I told an individual about this, and he later wrote, it was his uncle, and he later wrote a complete book about that one incident. But that was the closest I came to being hit by fighters. And the P-47 was a big heavy plane, and they would escort us. But in our particular raids that we went on, we had the P-51s. And so I called them the cowboys of the sky, because they could just fly. Our formations were just very, very tight. We flew almost wingtip to wingtip to keep fighters from coming through. Well, the P-51s would come up and fly up close to us and wave and salute and carry on and exchange this and that. But you could see the features on it. And of course, they were based in France. By the time I got there, the fighter bases had all moved out of England over to France. And so France had been occupied. And so they were complete strangers to us, but yet they saved our bacon. They were our protectors, our little friends, actually. There was a 190 that was very deadly also, the 190. And they had certain squadrons that had great reputations as killers, like the Yellow Nose, that happened to be the 190s. Then they had others. And toward the end of the war, we had destroyed so many of their planes and shot down so many of their planes that we had colonels and generals, German colonels and generals, and the big shots were flying, you know, the guy that had shot down hundreds of enemy planes. And their count was always high because they fought a lot in the Spanish War before World War II. So, but yeah, well, they just say they were all the same, deadly. Some had rockets, some had cannons, and they all had machine guns, and they all had expert ace flyers, but they couldn't replace them. As we took them down, they had no way of training new men. So we won the war by attrition. And so the fourth book, I called it B-17 Memories, and I used all the stories, new stories I had. I made some wonderful contacts around the world with stories from guys all over the United States. A lot of Hoosiers, and amazing things that happened. Amazing. One man in particular witnessed the Berliners. The war ended and the Berliners were all leaving because they feared the Germans, and he saw them. He was flying over in relief, picking up prisoners and bringing them back, French prisoners, and bringing them back to France. And he witnessed all these people with push carts and bicycles and et cetera, taking their belongings and fleeing Berlin because the Russians are coming in from the other side. And then another man wrote about the fact that he was on this same plane, and they went to Austria and picked up all these French soldiers who were slaves, actually. See, what Germany always did was conquer a country and then make slaves, either kill them or make slaves of them. Well, so our job after the war, one of our jobs was to bring back all these prisoners, repatriate them. And he told how he felt when he picked up these poor, skinny people, starving actually, in Austria, and brought them back to France. And they all started singing the French national anthem as they flew in and crying. And I missed that. I missed that flight. But it was wonderful. Things like that besides the war. And so I consider Boys and B-17 Memories. It's called B-7. I made it too long. B-17 Memories, Memphis Belle to Victory, because it's from the start of the war to the end of the war. And I always cover the Holocaust. Every book I mentioned the fact that the war we were fighting the evil people who were not only in Germany and Italy, but also in Japan. They were conquering people, killing people, making slaves of people, and intent on doing the same thing to us. Everything dovetails together, and it takes, to me, it should be taught as an example of what happens when parts of the world decide they want to control the other parts of the world. And you have to have resistance, and you have to have defense. And today is just a perfect example of a repeat of what happened in World War I and World War II. The best way to have peace is to have a strong defense. They would alert you in the night before, and want to make sure you didn't get any sleep. So they tell you the night before you're going to fly, and so they were trying to our goal was to get to the mess hall, eat supper, and get to bed. Sleep was always a big thing because you never got enough sleep. But before a mission, you wanted to be sharp, and so we went to bed early, and they get you up about 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on how long that mission was going to be. And everything was hush-hush, and we knew absolutely nothing except you're up, go to the mess. So we had to get up and dress. And while putting on your long underwear and then putting on an electric suit. The electric suit was much like, I call it like a electric blanket, only it was much thinner. And so you put on your electric socks, your electric pants, your electric top, and you had electric gloves too. But then you put on your regular clothes, and then you go to the mess hall. You're dressed just about as heavy as you can be dressed, you know, big, heavy, like a pillboy, doughboy. You had all these big, fluffy clothing, and we always wore big, heavy boots for the warmth. And we'd tie our own extra shoes to the chute later. But the mess hall, and then from the mess hall, we caught a Jeep down to the briefing room. And the briefing room was probably one of the largest buildings on the base. We had very few buildings, but the briefing room would take you in. The officers would go in one section, and they get better information. The gunners would go in this section, and we'd get basic information. The intelligence officer would come up and always wanted to keep us in suspense. So here's a little stage and a big curtain. So he came up, drew back the curtain, and there was our target. It was actually just a map. And the map would have lines on it showing you how we were going to fly in, where the flak was, and how we were going to avoid that and get on in. Because they basically knew where fixed flak guns were. The flak guns that really worked us were the ones that were portable on trains and on barges. And they were all portable. They could be hooked up to a truck and moved. But basically, they had a lot of flak towers where the flak guns were fixed. Anyway, the map showed how to go in and hit the target, what the target was going to be. That was our big interest. And if it was a real heavily guarded target, it just, everybody would scream, you know. And if it was an easy target we thought might be easy. There really weren't any easy targets, but things like Schweinfurt, munition dumps and airplane factories and et cetera, those are the ones really protected. So we see the map, and we fly in, how to get in, how to get out. And then we go on down to the equipment shed and pick up our parachutes and pick up our harness and our parachutes and maybe anything else we needed. That was basically it, because our flak vest and our earphones and everything were already on the plane. Our guns were already loaded. The planes had been gassed up the night before. The bombs were on the planes, and the fuses weren't in them, but the bombs we were completely loaded. And all we had to do was get in the plane and go to your position and see that everything was the way you wanted it. And of course, I went to the radio desk and checked the code. The secret codes would be there, usually 3 different codes. And basically we use rearranged letters and numbers and et cetera for letters. And I had to tune I had been given the frequencies. Usually they gave us 3 frequencies in case we had to switch. And so on the plane, I sat at my desk, my chair was a swivel chair, and I faced the receivers, the desk, and the code key. And behind me were the transmitters, a big, heavy liaison transmitter about that big, and it had drawers that you could slide in and out, and big cathode tubes about like that. You guys would laugh at it today, but the drawers, we had tuning units, and so we could pull out a drawer and tune that one, and then store it over here, and then pull out another drawer and tune that one and store it over here, and then tune the one we were going to use presently and slap it in there. And so it was a quick change deal to change frequencies if you had to. And so, as I said, the Morse code was there, the receiver and the key, and then we sat and waited. Now the plane was powered by little putt-putt motors. We got our electricity from putt-putt motors until ready to take off, so we could do all this. And then we just sat there and froze, waited, and if the weatherman cleared us for the mission, why a colored flare was shot. We call them Very pistols. They shoot that thing in the air and take it. And so we started we had already warmed up the engines, so we'd taxi on out in position. And we would just line up down that fairway, pull out of the parking. We called our parking areas hard stands. The B-17 had to have a concrete base or it would just sink in the mud. So every base had 3 runways for the wind, and then they had hard stands around those runways. So the concrete was actually, we used a lot of concrete in England. I mean, no wonder the island didn't sink. but pulling off the hard way and lining up, and we'd take off whenever minute or so, or 3 minutes, about usually the limit. And that plane would weigh 54,000 pounds, loaded with bombs and gas, oil, and machine gun. And we'd go on runways. Runways were always short, usually short, but we'd get that thing and start down the runway, and then the plane would shake and go, and the motors, you had 4 horsepower, 4 1,200 horsepower motors on the wings. And so when you took off, the entire plane was shaking, and it was striving to get into the air. And you'd lift that 54,000 pounds into the air. Some would have an engine problem or something and never get off the ground and just pull off into the mud. Once in a while, someone would take off just long enough to get airborne and then crash. And once you got into the air over England, we always flew. We flew in weather they wouldn't dare fly in today. But we followed a radio beam up in, so our pilot would take off and peel off and follow this radio beam, get on the radio beam, follow it right up to the end of the sky, maybe 8,000, 10,000 feet. And once you got up there, then you had to form your squadrons. So somebody would, the first guy off, squadron leader would fire off a flare, and everybody would form on him. So when you got that squadron formed, meantime, over here, your other squadrons were forming. And all over England, you can imagine 500, 600 loaded bombers up there trying to get together and form. First they form the squadrons, and then they form the formation, and then they'd have to join the bomber stream. And everything had to be coordinated. And it was almost as dangerous forming a rendezvous up there as it was on the mission. And there were many, many crashes, mid-air collisions. I knew a couple of guys that died in it. I was in one on a practice run. And it was, I mean, bombers would just, when you're flying that close together, and if one of them drops or one of them get too high, and once they get together, it's a mess. And you just have a sky full of debris and men. And they always tried to be high enough as you could bail out. But if too tangled, then many times they just crashed across the countryside. Once you formed that formation and joined the bomber stream, then we went always out over the North Sea. We had conquered France, so there's no point to going across the Channel. We just went out over, we were in southeastern England, we just took off out over the North Sea, and right out over the Netherlands, Holland, and then in Amsterdam, there's the German fighter base. So they would come to greet us. And so we had to get altitude in a hurry, and we'd get up to about 20 to 25,000 feet, and then they would come up after us. And then, of course, our fighters would go after them. And it was just a circus all for the rest of the day. And you'd fly maybe 3 hours into the target and bomb it. As I said, you went in. You had the position reports. You had to avoid the flak on the ground. And then you had to watch for fighters. But when you got near the target, they could track you. And once you started a bomb run, and the bombardier had the plane, and you were starting on the bomb run, you couldn't move it. That plane had to be absolutely level. And since we were lead crew, we had to do the best. And we had a lead navigator, a lead pilot, and a lead bombardier. And everybody else dropped their bombs when we dropped ours. So it's a matter of going into the target, and the flak was just everywhere. And it would explode all around you. And if you were close enough to see it explode into the red flare, then you knew it was really close. You could see the fire in that shell. Flak was a shell about 18 inches tall that came up, and when it exploded, it was just like a shotgun shell. The pieces were very small and deadly, and they could riddle the plane, or they could riddle the men in the plane and not take the plane down necessarily. But and that's why we had so many wounded and so many dead. And so straight into the target, through the flak, open the bomb bay doors, and you're in. And once you drop the bombs, that plane would just lift up like that, all that weight. And then you go on out and form your formations. Then the matter of getting home was the fact that if your plane was still in one piece, you hadn't lost an engine or anything, then you stayed with the formation. If your plane had been damaged or anything, you were suddenly out of the formation and you were fighter bait instantly, you know. And the only thing we had to do was call for help. Somebody go help him. Well, that's a matter of how many fighters you're going to send to protect one bomber and leave the rest. So a lot of deadly decisions are made. Once the bomber went down, or the pilot knew it was done. So the pilot was a commander. He was a captain, and his word was absolute law. So if he said bail out, you bailed out. And if he said he thought you could make it, sometimes crews would just vote on it. You going to stay with the plane, or you going to go out? And some would stay with the plane and make it. Some would stay with the plane and go down. Some would bail out and become prisoners of war, which was a whole different story. Our planes, meanwhile, would come back, low on fuel, and maybe injured aboard. But we'd come back to the base, and the injured always got to land first. But any plane was injured with an injured man on it would fire a pistol, a red flare, and they got to go in first. And the medics and the ambulances were waiting right there and take them right off the plane. And then damaged planes went in next, and then the rest of us came in. One of the occupations was on the day you weren't flying, you go down to the flight line and watch them come in, see who made it and who didn't. And it was that type of thing. And we flew, as I said, we flew every day that it was possible to fly, somebody was in that air. And the radar dome on the bottom made it possible to bomb even in bad weather. So that worked against us. We flew more often. And the fact that we were lead crew, we didn't fly as often. We were testing equipment over Scotland and England, making sure that lead plane with the radar was working. But being lead crew was a dubious honor because we were there much longer than the average crew. Took us long. So you were required to fly 25 missions early in the war. But later in the war, you were required. By the time we got there, it was 35 missions. And so we would probably still been there because we were just flying about every fourth mission as lead crew. And so I stayed there, and I was there 9 months. I was there from November till May. Well, actually till July. The war ended May the 8th. We didn't leave until July the 9th. We were important to the British people. They treated us like the Yanks were jokes, but also Yanks were their saviors. You know, we were growing up every day and trying to save England and the United States and that's the free world. And so it's kind of heroes. And you put on the uniform and they give you a medal or two and a ribbon, and so we wore the Eisenhower jacket, little short jacket. And I weighed about 150 pounds. I was no gut. And so we kind of enjoyed it. It was kind of an honor. And you get a stripe about every month. You get another stripe. We went over as corporals and came back. I went over as corporal and came back as a tech sergeant. The radio man, the engineer became tech sergeants. That was their rank. The gunners were buck sergeants or staff sergeants. And then you'd get busted and lose your rank, and you were still flying, you know, until you got it back. But no, and the people were, I said, the people were very nice. And we had this small town, Dis and I, to go into and go to the pubs, and we could actually drink a beer in England. Couldn't drink a beer yet. We could drink a beer, and et cetera. And teenagers today are much like we were. you think that you're not going to die. You think you're invincible. They drive down the road texting, and they do this, do that, they smoke, they drink. They think they're going to live forever. And I think we almost had to have that attitude. Well, yet we knew that we could die any day. And when you went to the mess hall every morning before a mission to eat, maybe when you came back at night, the guys you ate with wouldn't be there. A lot of them got shot down and put in POW camps. Some of them got shot down and their plane would land in friendly territory in Belgium or France, and then a day or two they'd show up. One of our best crews was in a mid-air collision, and they went down, and we were just heartbroken. And they came in and cleaned out their barracks. 2 days later, they came in from Belgium on another plane, and they went right back flying missions. They gave them a week off, and they were right back in the air. There's one of the old boys in that mid-air collision. He's still living. His name's John Gann, and he's in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's one of the few guys that of my age, I still know, veterans that I still have contact with. We flew back to Iceland. We took our planes. The war in the Pacific wasn't open, and so we flew our planes from they all waved by, all the townspeople. The British people were the most warm people you ever saw. They were cold. They wouldn't talk to you very much, but they were warm. And when you went to the pub, buy you a drink, Yank, buy you a drink. And London was the same way. The people treated you beautifully. And the people of I came down to the runway to wave us goodbye. And we left them our bicycles. And we flew to Wales and then Iceland and then Labrador and home. There again, we came home. The Depression was not over. They gave us $20 a week until we could find a job. And things were slow. I mean, the transition from war to manufacturing didn't happen overnight, and so there weren't a lot of jobs. I went to school. I went back to my job at $1 an hour at an auto parts store for about 2 months, and then I said, no, I've been poor long enough. I'm going to be college and be rich. So I came to IU. I was home. I flew 20 missions before I was 20, and I was in IU before I was 21. And I managed down through the years, I managed to get 3 degrees and 3 teacher licenses. But no, I took the GI Bill saved us. The GI Bill actually built the country and helped the greatest generation build the country. And so we knew that if we survived, we could come home and get training for a job or get an education. And I wanted to be a teacher anyway. I didn't want to be rich. I made up my mind that God had spared me, I had lived, and I wasn't going to be rich. I was going to be satisfied and comfortable. And so I became a teacher. And I had 3 months off every summer. I had weekends off. And later on, I made the mistake of being principal, and I got less time off. And then I went to the superintendent's office, and I got 1 day a week off. And then I went back to being principal. And then I retired. As a boy, I lived in a 4-room house with no water, no electricity, no central heat. We carried the water from a pump, or we got it from a neighbor and helped pay the water bill. We lived from hand to mouth. There were no such thing as television, air conditioning, computers, none of the soft life we have today. I always say we were lean and mean, and we ate whatever food we could get. Basically, it was wholesome food that we raised as much as we could. The government gave us some. And Franklin Roosevelt he started a social security, and he started helping people come out of poverty. And then the war brought us out completely because we had to organize and arm ourselves, and we had all these factories, all these empty factories, but we turned them into war factories, won the war, and then turned them back into refrigerators and television and things like that. The fifth book is my ego book. I did my own drawing and my own illustrations and picked my own photographs, and I decided that I had told so much about my combat experience and my personal life, I might just as well open an entire page. And so I went back into my boyhood before the war and talked about living in the poverty of the Great Depression. So what I did in my little book about my boyhood, I called it Leatherwood Creek. I used 5 boys, 5 imaginary boys who were really composites of my buddies. And I got told how we were free to run through the woods and the creeks and swim in the quarries and caddy at the golf course. And we had all kinds of jobs. We had paper routes, we had caddies, you could work about any of the little stores. The entire town was composed of little stores. Now all those little stores are in one big store. And so there's no work. That boys, I feel sorry for kids today, teenagers especially, because they have nothing to do. We used to help farmers put up hay. We used to work in the stores. We used to run paper routes. Caddy, we sat pins at the bowling alley. Any way you could make a quarter an hour. And it was a completely different world, and poverty was the thing that made us so tough and hard, I guess. And so that's what I've done. I've been honored with many people. On the back of this book I put Senator Steele honored me before the General Assembly. And Becky Skillman was there. She was lieutenant governor, and she helped there. And so, and Eric Cook was a representative. So they took me before the General Assembly and actually honored me. And I even got a standing ovation in the House. And then people like Todd Young has given me a citation for being veteran of the 9th District, etc. Joe Donnelly has read my book and wants to do another interview, another recording. My biggest event came when the mayor of Bedford, Shona Gurgis, recognized me as a Veteran of the Year and Grand Marshal in 2015. And I wandered up there, told my family about it, and wandered up there, and it was a big event, and the huge flag went up, and then here come the keynote speaker, and it was Governor Pence. And so Governor, he did a very good job of recounting what I had done and etc. So I asked him if he'd ride with me in the convertible, and he did. And so I flashed that all over the country. You know, here I am with Vice President of the United States, my buddy. I have a letter from the Queen of England. I sent her my first book. It's not from the Queen personally, it's from her lady in waiting. And I've done all this thing to publicize. Like I said, it's an ego trip, but it's also self-satisfaction, knowing that I'm doing something. And I went to one of my buddies the other day at the nursing home, and he said, "Hell, Hutch, you're a celebrity." And I said, "Okay, I'll accept that." On a very minor basis. I'm a big duck in a little puddle. But what I'm trying to do is, I'm not making money. It's not really about money-making project. I tell people it's a nonprofit organization, because the time I devote and the funds I devote to it, but selling the books on the internet, et cetera, it evens out. I mean, I'm not going to be rich, even if as the old boy said, if you win the lottery, what are you going to do? You just keep on riding till it's all gone. But I have achieved my dream. I lived what I wanted to do. I like to talk to young people, talk to classes, and I tell them the first thing to do is to have pride, and the second thing to do is to be themselves. The most complicated computer on earth is your brain, and it's yours, and your body is yours, and what you do with it and what you do with your brain is determine how long you'll live. And then, of course, you have to say nobody lives forever. And so, but I think that we need more instruction in schools about life and living than we do about all these other faldy-rall things they teach. And whatever your religion is, it guides you. And so you're a prisoner of your own decisions. Whatever you become will be, you decided it, or you gave in. So don't give in. I'm 92, and I can sit here and talk to you about all the things that happened. I've been blessed by God.